Thank you very much. Well, dear organisers, dear participants, I'm both pleased and honoured to be here today to give this keynote. This is a very important and timely conference, research with international students. There are so many relevant and timely topics to address. The one I picked today is positionality. And we work with international students, and I was pleased that already yesterday some of you were mentioning this topic. So I hope I can sort of continue on for some of the discussions we heard yesterday. And before I start, I just have a disclaimer. I've spent 10 days with a nasty throat infection. I'll do my best not to start coughing, but if I do, please bear with me. Yes. So without further ado, what did you do before? It worked just before? Yeah. So this quote by Trinka Bariscia, I think it explains quite nicely why positionality is important. She argues that taking positionality seriously creates greater transparency for the situated knowledge produced and advocates for a more nuanced approach to education research that considers the multifaceted nature of educational spaces and the experiences of students within them. So based on that, I will venture into the whole issue of why positionality is important. And this is the topic I'll touch upon, just a few words about what is positionality. And then I'll talk about my own embodied experiences of positionality over my different types of research, which you've already heard a few words about. I'll talk about being an insider in educational research, because that's a common positionality, which I think is worth some thoughts. Then I'll talk about spatial dimensions of positionality, and finally about power positionality and research with international students. And I'll just give you a sec to find the seat. Yeah. So what is positionality? Well, that's the social and political positions of those involved in the research, both the researcher and the participants. That means when we talk about positionality, sometimes we only talk about the position of the researcher, but I think it's equally important to bear in mind the positionalities of the participants of the research. And positionality is about acknowledging and understanding how our positionalities, how our social, cultural, and personal identities, how they shape our perspectives, how they shape our biases, and the interpretations we have during the research process. And Victoria Ray, she talks about an ethnographic toolkit and how we can use this toolkit strategically. And what she argues is that when we're trying to sort of figure out what is positionality, we can distinguish between the visible characteristics, that's gender representation, that's our age, our ethnicity, our appearance, those things that we carry with us into the room, where we look at somebody and immediately we get these impressions of who is that person, even if we don't do that consciously. Those are those visible characteristics we carry with us. And then she also talks about the non-visible characteristics. That is what you can't really see: our family background, our profession, our nationality, and in case of us in this room, our academic degrees. And we use these, both the visible and the non-visible characteristics, when we negotiate access, when we try to build rapport, and we use these whether we know it or not, as I will also show you. And then we are encouraged to have this reflective practice and write about positionality. But what we often see is what some researchers label shopping list positionality. So that reflective practice becomes nothing more than shopping list positionality. What is that, you may ask? Well, Louise Brooks has this interesting way of explaining it. That she says, we often see these shopping list positionality statements in a paper, and by this she means a solely descriptive position statement of the researcher's identity and characteristics, and how these are similar or dissimilar to their participants. You can probably recognize that as something you've seen in papers, and I guess from now on at least you recognize that when you see that in a paper. And it becomes this sort of checklist, positionality check, I've written about it, without actually using it for any kind of purpose. Instead, positionalities should be seen as something fluid. as something relational and something that emerged in the situations we're in. And that's why shopping list positionalities are no good, because you can't just make a list, because if our positionalities are fluid, if they emerge in the situation, you can't just list them because you don't know how other people will see you. And they are not total and they are not static. And as researchers, we use these different positions which are available to us. We use them strategically, but it's important to bear in mind that we cannot control them. And that's why that shopping list mentality, that doesn't work, because that's also assuming that we can control these positionalities. And they are at stake at all phases of the research process. And they can be at stake in all sorts of different ways. And we are encouraged to sort of reflect about these things and to have that reflective practice. But again, it becomes sometimes a hollow statement, because how do you train yourself to have that reflective practice? And what I'm arguing here is that we should just start, or not just, we should start with our own embodied experiences of how positionality can be at stake. Because that's where it really matters, that when you have that embodied experience that you still carry with you years later. And what I'm going to do now is to present some of those embodied experiences from my own research. So I will have 3 examples from my own research based on going back to when I was doing research with Fulani and Mats in Senegal over my postdoctoral research with graduates in the Egyptian desert. So when it really started to be something I experienced as a pertinent issue, namely when I started doing research in Denmark. That was when positionality became complicated. It wasn't very much in these situations compared to what I did in Denmark. And I'll show how by using my different positionalities strategically, I have sort of drawn on the different positions available to me during my fieldwork, also when I wasn't really aware of it. So, a few photos from Senegal. The Fulanis, they are cattle herders. It's a quite a Sigi couple. And what I was interested in studying was nomadic mobility, decision making in relationship to walking in one direction or another direction, and how the relationship between their ethnic identity as Fulani, how that was related to their mobility. So that was where I started off. Then when I went on my first fieldwork, I was together with my supervisor because he had some context I could benefit from. And I was introduced to relevant stakeholders in the field. And traveling with him, I couldn't help noticing how he was introduced as Monsieur le Professeur. He had this grey hair, the grey beard. And I was introduced as Mademoiselle la étudiante. I was a young student. And that gave rise to different possibilities for us, I noticed at some point. Like when he wanted to ask a question, people sort of looked at him a bit sort of hesitant, a bit like, well, if you're the professor, how come you don't know? Why are you asking us? Whereas I found pretty soon I had the liberty of asking questions, because I was positioned as a young student, as somebody who didn't know, as somebody who was there to learn. And I was quite amused by that. And I thought, well, that's great. I'll use that. That's how I'm sort of going to introduce myself continuing on. And that's what I did. I said, I'm here to learn. I don't know anything about nomadic traditions. I don't know much about cattle. Could you please explain to me? It's actually quite easy to conduct fieldwork in Senegal amongst the nomads because they were so friendly. They were so open. They were like, oh, they would answer any kind of strange question I would have. And I didn't think much about positionality, to be honest. I know I'm here at a local shopping list, white female young student. That was sort of how you could say, I saw myself, or how I also was positioned. But it occurred to me that more than anything, I was just a stranger. I evaded those categories because even though I was a woman, I was so different from the women there that it wasn't really something that we would have much in common. Even though I was young, the way I was living a young life was so different from their ways of living. So more than anything, I was just a stranger. And Australia, they were willing to host, to share their stories and all sorts of things. So I quite enjoyed that fieldwork and didn't think much about positionality, to be honest. After that, I started my postdoctoral research where I studied graduates in the Egyptian desert. Egypt is a fairly large country, 1 million square kilometers, give or take. Almost, I think, 80, 90 million people live there today, but they live within 4% of the territory, which means it's extremely densely populated along the River Nile. And therefore, the government has tried through different decades to move people into the desert. And they had a project called the Mubarak Project, where they tried to make graduates, make new villages in the desert. The idea was that if you take a group of people with an education, for instance, in agriculture, they have the capacity to build new communities out in the middle of nowhere. And it was really fascinating because what you can see is like, it's desert, there's nothing there. And then they add water with sprinklers from the Nile, and they try to green the desert. And it's quite a project of social engineering, you might say. So I found it quite fascinating. And I worked together with the American University in Cairo. They helped me to gain access. And I thought, why change the winning game? So I carried on my positionality as the young student who was there to learn. But that failed miserably. People simply, they were so suspicious. They were like, why should we send you that? Why are you asking those questions? Well, you said you're interested in that. How come you're asking us about that? And it was really difficult for me to conduct the fieldwork. Also, that was among the graduates in the desert. I also made interviews with people in ministries. It was difficult for me to gain access in the beginning, and I was really struggling. And then I realized that what really mattered was the fact that I actually had a PhD degree. So, went home, got new business cards, had doctor in front of my name, changed my clothes to much more formal business clothes. So I changed the positionalities available to me in a very strategic manner. When I entered into government offices in a suit and with a doctora in front of my name, and sort of carried with me with a certain sort of confidence and not that more humble, I'm here to learn. Things were so different. So I was open because what mattered there was academic degrees. So people in the offices were really willing to talk to me and share data and whatever. That was really nice. I was still struggling a bit in the field. People were quite suspicious. And at some point I was asked, well, are you just an Israeli spy? So, where did that come from? I was like, I don't think I look like an Israeli spy, but I don't know what an Israeli spy would look like in the first place. And I was like, do you want to see my passport? And they're like, no, you can just have 2 passports. So I was really struggling finding out how can I build rapport with people? What is it that's missing here? And trying to negotiate which way, what can I use to actually make myself become a trustworthy person. And I don't know exactly, apart from spending time coming back, showing, well, if I promise something, I'll keep that promise. And in the end, I managed to build a good relationship with some other people. And what I learned was also that some of the things taking place in those villages were actually illegal. And because they were illegal, they didn't want to share those stories with somebody they couldn't trust. So I learned all that, and that also shows how positionalities are something we negotiate, how they're relational, how we can't control them. So you see again my shopping list here, but also how they can work. So I had to come up with different parts of my positionality to negotiate to actually, be able to carry out my work. Then, while I was doing that research, I became more and more interested in the construction of knowledge in research communities. And that's because you could say what I was doing was rural studies and rural geography. And together with a good friend of mine, we were both in rural geography, and we were really surprised why rural geography in Denmark was so boring. And we wanted to go to conferences in the UK all the time because here people really knew how to make rural geography interesting. And we couldn't help wondering, how come it's so boring? Why are our colleagues not inspired by what's going on in the UK? And we made this small project trying to understand how research communities actually involved. How come that some theories, some ways of working become invoked in some disciplines and not in others, or in some countries and not in others? So while we were doing our postdoctoral research, we also carried out this small project. And that was when positionality was really something that became an issue. Because we started to interview our former colleagues at the geography department where we grew up, so to speak. So we were there as fellow researchers, as former colleagues, and we interviewed one of our professors, which was a supervisor for leading it. And that interview is the one that sort of sits for me as when I learned about positionality in that very painstaking way where it can be really difficult. Because when we had decided I was going to conduct the interview because I had not had her as my supervisor. I started asking questions and she was like resisting all the time. It was as if she didn't really want to accept the positions of the interviewee and the interviewer. So she was struggling with that, and I had never experienced that in that way before. And I was asking questions based on the interview guide, and at some point, you know how sometimes people have answered the question before you have actually asked it? And I said, oh, just hang on for a minute, I have to, because you answered that already. And she just looked at me and said, well, didn't you prepare well enough? And it was like, because she used to be my teacher, it was like, I felt so told off. I never experienced that in an interview situation before. So she kept sort of negotiating the roles with us. And afterwards, we were like, wow, there's something really interesting here. And that was when we started really reading about positionality. Also because we interviewed some fellow, or he had been a PhD student a couple of years prior to us, so he was slightly older, but not that much older. And when we interviewed him, he had the way what he did was he distanced himself from us. He told us a lot of things we knew already. And my friend Lena, she thought afterwards, she said, I'm not being so arrogant. He told us all these things we know already. And I was like, no, he was just being so friendly because he was trying to ease this awkward situation by taking on this distance for us to actually be able to maintain that role as the interviewer. So that was when we started to unpack what does it mean to listen about positionalities and how we negotiate them. And we learned about the insider-outsider positionalities, and that's something we see that are very common in educational research. But often we talk about them in this way, sort of this very binary way, as if you're either one or the other. But what I would argue is it's something we negotiate all the time. And you can try to start off as an insider because you know people, but they may not accept you as that insider. So I think the insider-outsider dichotomy is really interesting. So as I said, it's very common in the field of education because, well, after all, we're studying ourselves when we're studying education. And there are various definitions. A common definition is that you're an insider when you have an attachment to or an involvement in the organization or its social groups prior to commencing the study. And you can argue that was what we had when we were interviewing our former colleagues. Another definition is that you are an insider if the participants see you as an insider. Again, how do we understand insider? So are you an insider because you know people already? So are you an insider due to your participants, or are you an insider due to the topic? Because that's another part of it. When we interview international students, we can see each other as insiders because we know what it's like to be students, all of us. Some of us have also been international students ourselves, so we are insiders in terms of the topic, but not necessarily in terms of knowing people. So there are all these different ways we can be seen as insiders. And I don't think it's particularly important whether it's one definition or the other. What's really important is how we use that insider positionality in the interview situation. And I find that very fluid as I said, it's not a binary. You can move from one to another. And what we experienced when we were interviewing our former colleagues was, at some point we asked some questions about knowledge. And I remember how the atmosphere in the room changed. And I think what happened in that minute was that we changed from being insiders. We shared that story, we shared that background, but by asking these questions, we showed that we no longer shared that ideal of what the good research was. So within a second, we changed from being insiders to being outsiders by asking one particular question. And some of you are nodding now, and I really like that because some of you have probably experienced that. By asking a question, you can change from being an insider to being an outsider. And when you're not aware of that in the situation, all the experience is, wow, the atmosphere changed. And you might get a bit nervous because sort of you're thrown off track in terms of how you're going to ask your questions. But be aware of that just by asking a question, by using a certain language, people may no longer see you as an insider. And that's why that positionality is so fluid and how it's relational and negotiated. That's what I mean by that. And in research with international students, in this occasional research, I find there's this emphasis to use the insider positionality as if we think that is the best thing to, if we can use that. We use that to gain access, and we use it to build rapport, because we think then people will open up to us if we share that insider positionality. But what I will argue is that it's a dangerous position to hang on to too much, because there's often an assumed idea about solidarity in the insider positionality. And if you don't have that solidarity, you'll easily be seen as an outsider. But even if you have that solidarity, how can you ask some critical questions? How can you really probe if you have taken on that insider positionality, which is, I know, I share, I've been an international student myself, then it can become much more difficult for you to actually ask the questions you want to ask. And I'll come back to the trainers just in a second. I can see some of you wondering. I was just thinking of an example which is, I guess, quite timely these days, of a colleague I had once, a Danish Jew who was going to do his field work in the West Bank with Jewish settlers. And he kept emphasizing how his insider positionality as a Jew, how that would be helpful for him. And unfortunately, I didn't talk to him after he returned from field work. But I couldn't help wondering when he told me that it might not be a helpful positionality, because he might not share the political sentiments of those Jewish settlers in the West Bank. And because he had the fellow Jewish identity, he might actually be seen as a traitor, or at least not as somebody trustworthy, where it might have been easier for somebody coming there not being a fellow Jew to actually conduct that field work. And for me, that stands out as a very sort of powerful example of how that insider positionality may not be the best way to open up to build rapport. A really interesting article I read just last week, and I have the references towards the end, is written by a Danish, one of my colleagues actually, Tringa, a PhD student who has been studying Danish youth at high school. And Tringa, she's one of the trainers. She explains in this article, which is called spatial attachments and positionality, and she explained how she started conducting field work at high school, and she can easily pass for being sort of just an average Dane. She's tall with brown eyes and straight, long, blonde, brown hair, but she's not just a Christian Dane. She also has a background. Her parents are Kosovo-Albanian, and she's actually a Muslim. But she has this sort of, she can pass. When she enters a room, her visible characteristics, to come back to that concept, will make her pass as just a Christian Dane. Then when she started to hang out with some of the youth at this high school, they asked her where she had been to high school. And just by explaining where she went to high school, they looked at her and said, so, are you Muslim? So, where are you from? Because they knew that high school would be a high school with a highly diverse population. And that's what she means when she talks about spatial attachments, and how just by saying where we're from, people see us in a new way. And when she was then positioned as one of them, this group of students who hang out at a special couch, she wanted to hang out with them and understand their perceptions of being racialized youth in Danish high school. And what she also did to actually fit in, to sort of take on that insider positionality, was she was very sort of aware of how she dressed. And she stopped wearing trainers from the brand Adidas, Asics, or New Balance, because these are white trainers, so to speak. So she started wearing those, because then she was recognized as a fellow sort of with an ethnic background. And she used that positionality to link to these students. And I think it's really interesting the way she describes how she uses that, those visible characteristics, which are actually a bit ambiguous, so she can use them in a different way. And I can't help reading, I think the article is wonderful, I'm sure she's done really nice research, but I can't help thinking also when you do so much to actually fit in, to build that positionality as somebody who's sort of a fellow insider, how that affects the kind of questions you can then ask. Because what we experienced when we interviewed our colleagues was that sometimes when we asked questions, they would say, so why are you asking me? You should know these things. Why are you actually asking me this? You should know already. So I think that's what we have to be aware of when we draw too much on that insider positionality. And I'll continue now with the spatial dimensions of positionality. As I said, we can use that our different positions as a way of gaining access. And also, sometimes we can't control things, because I've been working in parts of the world where they have gender segregation. There's some spaces we can enter into and some spaces we can't enter into. And what Tringa Borussia experienced was that we didn't get access to certain classes that were labeled difficult because the headmaster was afraid of what she would see in those classes. So it's both a matter of where will you actually be allowed to go, but it's also a matter of how will you become accepted into those spaces. And that was what Tringa did. She sort of changed her clothes to dress differently to actually become accepted into certain spaces. And I did a bit the same in Egypt. I dressed differently to actually become accepted as somebody who could be trusted in a government office. And that's what Borussia talks about when he says that gatekeepers co-constitute our research positionalities by their reading of us, reflected in the access granted. So it's a matter of which positions are actually available to us based on our visible and non-visible characteristics. And that relates to the concept of spatial attachments. And she explains that bodies not only gain meaning from where they dwell at school, but also from the spaces they're associated with. And I think that's quite interesting how, because we don't think of that, but as soon as we say, well, I've been to high school there, or I did this and I did that, these spatial attachments also are part of our positionalities and we can use them. So the place of origin and our positionality, they are linked. And they're also linked, some of the studies I've read from the UK, here they're very linked in terms of accents. Well, an accent is not a visible characteristic, but nonetheless a characteristic you can carry with you quite strongly. So people will read you based on your accent and where you're from. And there's some nice examples of that in these folks' article. And also one about, I have the reference towards the end, I found an article about hair in Greater Manchester and positionality. There's something about accents in that as well. So we are seen as somebody based on where we're from. We're seen as somebody with a certain socioeconomic status, or even a certain race or religion, based on where we're from. And we may become intelligible to others by that spatial attachment. Oh, so you're from that place. Okay, you're that kind of person. Oh, you're somebody like that. I can relate to you, or I can't relate to you. And we use that as a way of building rapport. But I think it's important to note that coming from the same area, having the same spatial origin, it may be a way of building rapport for people to trust you, but it may not mean you have the same experiences or you share the understandings. So we can end up being outsiders in the middle of a conversation. Yes, I'll just skip that because I want to go to my last point, which is power, positionality, and research with international students. And as we've been talking about yesterday, and which all of you have read in the book as well, research with international students, that is about treating international students and their knowledges, languages, and cultures as epistemic equals. It's about including students as participants and co-researchers. It is to focus on their experiences, behaviors, attitudes, and understanding that. And it's also research with international students also represents critical scholarship that problematizes power dynamics. And the power dynamics, that's my last point. Because in the concept research with international students, there's this ideal about equality, about sharing. And that's an ideal that I know pretty well because I'm from Denmark. I grew up in a Nordic context. And here my positionality is part of how I understand this topic. Because I grew up in a socio-political setting where we value equality very highly, where we talk about having low power hierarchies, where we have different types of leadership. We talk about collegial leadership, about collective management. From kindergarten, we have all these democratic traditions. We have to hear from everybody. We talk about consensus. And as much as I like that, I also become a bit hesitant sometimes because it also hides power. And I've had bosses who didn't want to acknowledge the power they had. They wouldn't accept that they were in a power position in relation to me. So they could say if we knew somebody was going to be laid off, they say, "Oh, I'm not involved in that position." Come on, I'm sure somebody will ask you, but they didn't want to sort of change that collegial relationship we had. And I find not accepting the power you have and not living it can actually be an act of oppression. And I want us to carry that with us when we talk about research with international students. So we should be aware of the kind of power we have as researchers and the extent to which we can actually share that power so we don't lie to people. Because I think that is an act of oppression that's actually worse than admitting your power. So I like this quote by Jill and Rose about power and positionality. Reflecting on their respective positions, a researcher situates both herself and her research subjects in the same landscape of power, which is the context of the research project in question. However, the research must be placed in a different position from the researcher since they are separate and different from her. Differences between researcher and researched are imagined as distances in this landscape of power. So we are in the same landscape of power, but we are not the same. And if we want to redistribute the power, because we're doing research with international students, so we want to redistribute the power of knowledge produced by involving participants and process, we still need to analyze the terrain of power in which research takes place. And that may sound very fancy, but in effect, it is actually, it's not simple, but we can break it down into some points. And I like the concept, the analytical power of the researcher, because that is what this is about. As researchers, we have the analytical power, and that consists in, that is a privileged position of the researcher, and that privilege consists in these points. That by deciding the research topic in the first place, you are in the position of power. You have decided this is a relevant topic to conduct research in. And I know some of you also talked about how we should involve participants in finding research questions. And that's very well, but even that decision is a decision of power. To decide to involve people is also a power. Deciding who to interview or where to conduct the field work, that is a decision of power. And by deciding the questions asked in an interview situation, deciding the questions asked, the flow of the discourse, when questions are asked, all these things, that's the analytical power of the researcher. And also by having the right of interpretation and where the research should be published and how should it be presented at a conference. All these things are power decisions. And we should be aware at which stages do we actually sort of share the power with the students. What can we promise them? If you're a PhD student yourself, you're positioned in a landscape of power. You have a supervisor, you have different things to live up to, so you can't decide everything for yourselves. You can't, not necessarily promise people too much. So we should be aware of the power we have and how we can share that. And don't promise people to share something which you can't. Because even if we want to share this power, we are not situated equally in this landscape of power. And as I said, you can hear I'm sort of passionate about this, and it's probably because I grew up. That's due to my positionality as somebody who grew up in a society where we value equality very much, but where it can be a bit suffocating if we pretend that we are equal when we're not. Yes. So this is my last slide. So I'll just sum up by saying not admitting to be in a power position can be an act of oppression, in my view. You should understand your positions of power, decide how, why, and when you want to share that power, and also why. Why is this important? Why is it important to share your power with that particular group of students, for instance? Explain this carefully to the participants so they understand their options. And a strategic use of positionalities, especially the inside of positionality as mentioned. If we use that to build rapport, we should also be aware that it can appear like manipulation. And that's not good if we are talking about sharing power. So it becomes very tricky if we sort of use our positionalities very strategically, if we emphasize that insider positionality, and at the same time want to have this very equal relationship that we may not be able to maintain. And you should also be aware that another aspect of power is that if you listen to people's stories and kind of research, when we do research with international students, you will also hear vulnerable stories. And when people share their stories with you, you end up in a position of power by having that story told to you. And you should treat that with the kind of respect that it deserves. So you should take responsibility for your choices and actions. And in research with international students, recognizing positionality becomes crucial due to these inherent dynamics due to our different cultural backgrounds and also the power differentials that are actually there. So these are my points. I have made a list of interesting literature I have enjoyed in this in making this presentation. And I'll leave that to you there and say thank you very much for listening to me.